Today General Hospital will reveal Britt's return is not merely a sensational reversal, but the ignition of a layered, long-horizon strategy to reconstruct power. Wrapped in the rhetoric of ethics and reform, she arrives at the hospital with a meticulously audited dossier, a remediation itinerary, renewed certifications, and concrete evidence of restored clinical competence after a long absence from the front line. Every document and metric is placed with intent, turning any counter-argument into an opportunity to isolate opponents on matters of principle. Almost simultaneously, Brad's reappearance after the $1 million arrangement from Drew stirs the still waters below. That money was once a shut-off valve, forcing him out of Port Charles along with a secret about Portia. Now it is redefined as leverage, legitimizing Brad's standing as an insider while unlocking a chain of financial proof even the most cautious never expected to have exposed. Britt and Brad begin by mapping the power lattice that clings to the hospital, who commands votes on the board, who steers equipment budgets, who liaises with research funds, and who brokers the insurance packages that cover clinical trials. This map is not a single sheet but layered schematics from personal networks to money flows to contract clauses. They prioritize seemingly harmless links, and data attached to grants, supplemental pages that tweak trial schedules, and those process optimization provisions typically skimmed over in long meetings. Every blind spot is flagged with a symbol and an estimate of reputational risk if exposed. Once the map is complete, a strategy of controlled leakage activates, vague breadcrumbs, half-formed evidence, and unanswered questions surface on niche blogs and ethics-minded medical outlets at a measured tempo. No bomb goes off, only the public pressure rises, forcing the board to crack the vent by convening an internal hearing. In lockstep with the media front, Britt quietly gathers professional allies. She volunteers for hard cases, takes on heavy lifts, registers for peer review, and publicly places herself under the microscope. She does not ask for forgiveness in words, she accrues moral capital in outcomes, protocols, and quality graphs. When a few stalled research programs start moving again thanks to her problem-solving, the board must acknowledge the practical upside of reinstating her under strict supervision. Britt's tightrope is precise. Every clinical step forward is tethered to a new transparency commitment, so any opponent of her return risks being framed as resisting reform. She shifts the center of gravity from "Does Britt deserve this?" to "Does the system have the courage to change?" Brad takes hold of the financial undertow. He extracts the old statements, builds a timeline of the $1 million transfer, and cross-references off-system emails ranging hush-hush meetings to illustrate a pattern of buying silence rather than buying justice. He does not need to indict Drew immediately. He need only pose a question large enough to justify an independent committee. Knowing donors' instinct to avoid risk, he quietly invites outside organizations known for hospital governance to provide informal counsel, creating the sense of a neutral audit architecture forming beyond Drew's reach. The mere arrival of the word independent shifts priorities among the board's pragmatists. They are no longer shielding any one person, they are protecting the institution's legitimacy. To lock the target, Brad creates a virtual data room of supply contracts, grant writers, and anonymized internal threads. He deftly invites hospital counsel, a few audit specialists, and Drew's people to access it. Every click is logged, and every question they ask becomes a breadcrumb pointing Britt toward the next scene to open. If Drew's camp requests file X, Brad preps related file Y. If they avoid topic A, he throws light on adjacent topic B. The data room operates as a reactive maze, where the opponent's movements inadvertently reveal what they fear most. Brad needs only one irregular pattern to convince the committee to issue formal document requests, and the ensuing trail creates a legal corridor for deeper inventories. Drew counters as seasoned power coordinators do, tightening communications, hiring PR, resurrecting Britt's messy past, and rallying business allies to reframe everything as a crusade to keep the hospital stable. He tries to build a glass wall out of NDA letters, hoping silence laws will hold the frame until the storm passes. The difference this time is tempo. He no longer sets it. Each clamp he tightens is mirrored in the data room logs, which show attempts to trawl, excise, and recontextualize. When a handful of off-system emails surface instructing how to schedule meetings to avoid independent members, the board is forced into what it hates, minuting on paper that conflict of interest signals require deeper inquiry. Portia stands in the hardest place. She is the clinical gatekeeper who was once drawn into a pact of silence. She knows which boundaries must hold and what happens when a hospital loses public trust. In closed-door meetings she forces herself into neutrality, proposing a strict clinical monitoring framework for Britt accompanied by a verifiable quality checklist. She neither excuses Britt's past nor denies the present benefits. She ties herself to numbers and process so personal attacks slide off target. This is discipline holding action. The more others argue from emotion, the more the data-driven voice becomes the anchor for the majority. To fortify the legal front, Britt launches a new shield, a transparency code for clinical research that she authors, demanding public pathways between funding and trial design. She cannot impose it unilaterally, but she can turn it into a litmus test. When a few board members endorse it, the door opens. The code is piloted into small units where Britt both treats and undergoes recurring cross-evaluation. The first 6-week readout nudges the calculators, protocol adherence up, complaints down, and the cost of polishing records nearly vanishes. Those numbers do not erase debates about past ethics, but they give traditional donors a pretext to re-engage under a new framework, thinning Drew's once absolute orbit. Meanwhile, Brad runs a quiet spear point at the ring of satellite suppliers for equipment and software. He traces offshore shells that act as conduits where consulting fees are pumped in and return as contract discounts. Each time he flips a link, he does not go public. He sets discreet meetings, offering partners a chance to self-correct contracts, add transparency clauses, and cut back privileges. Many comply, a stubborn few do not. It is precisely those holdouts that become stepping stones for widening the committee's scope. Brad's arrangement spreads the pain. One is shoved into a corner without exit, and that very way out increases cooperation. As the nurses' ball nears, nostalgia makes the town restless. No flashy sleights of hand this time. The drama migrates backstage into tight timelines. A satellite fundraiser for an oncology research program is chosen as the hinge. Britt takes a formal role on the coordination team, where each donor is asked to sign a new pledge of research independence. That same night, the data room unveils a new folder, negotiation minutes with a major supplier. Those minutes include a request to adjust communications language to blur the funding process relationship. The timing overlap funnels attention into one question: who narrates this story, board or the commercial partners? Drew gambles on a grand gesture, unveiling a large-scale endowment for a medical technology center branded with the hospital's name, promising capital just when the system craves positive PR. On the surface, it is flawless. Beneath, it is an attempt to torque the narrative, to force the question. Do we refuse money on a suspicion not yet proven? Britt and Brad do not deny the grant's value. They condition it on transparency criteria and third-party oversight as prerequisites. If Drew accepts, he dilutes his control. If he refuses, he stains the gift as narrative management. Either branch tips power away from him. A security subplot surfaces when fragments from Britt's WSB past are tugged into the present. Names like Sidwell and Pascal flicker in old briefs, enough to thicken the haze of doubt. Britt answers by inviting a constrained internal security sweep of her own devices, accounts, and system access. She turns a possible vulnerability into proof of her willingness to be scrutinized, making shadowy insinuations harder to stick. Brad, on the other flank, hardens their digital hygienic credential habits, access segmentation, work personal separation, minimal defenses, but sufficient to keep the main story centered on structural reform instead of witch hunts. When the independent committee formally expands its jurisdiction, the sequence is minute: contract production, transaction sampling, approval right audits, internal comms review. Each small closure is a marker, not enough to charge anyone, enough to force a spring cleaning. Drew, in the storm's eye, does not collapse. He recedes, showing up less, delegating coordination, stepping back from the brand's podium. For a man used to chairing the table, it is a bitter concession. For the system, it is the measured rebalancing that prevents a broader credibility failure. The depth here is that Brad and Britt are not playing for a single coup grace. They are changing habits. They bake a new reflex into the hospital. Every grant preconditioned on trial independence. Every improvement program paired with outside critique. Every pretty promise matched with a reporting cadence. They translate professional ethics into a quantifiable language, turn contrition into KPIs, and make redemption an operational platform. Once fresh numbers speak louder than stale whispers, they win not just a seat but the right to rewrite how the city measures trust. Still, nothing is conclusive. Beneath the lacquer of transparency, old fractures remain in the collective psyche. Everyone longs for clean endings, but self-cleansing is never tidy. An anonymous email surfaces, hinting at a forgotten subcontract unknown to keep the committee's temperature up. A long-time donor hesitates over the new criteria, creating a dangerous lull where old bargains might bob back up. Britt must still show up daily as if every year remains skeptical. Brad must ration every leak to stay within the system's tolerance. Portia continues to yoke her days to the quality checklist, the quiet metronome keeping the ship upright. And Drew, though no longer keeping time, is not easily written out. He has networks, experience, and resilience tempered by many seasons. This retreat can seed a new strategy in which he embraces transparency as the toll for rehabilitating his image within the new constraints. Or he can choose open confrontation, betting on a political media shock big enough to jolt the balance back. At this moving table, no one dares declare victory. Only this is true: a few chairs have new owners, a few rules have been altered, and some habits once thought immutable have bent. As always, Port Charles absorbs chaos and glows from the friction. The public gets a new story to chew on, the hospital pilots a new code, and two names long synonymous with scheming become architects of reform. No one forgets their past, yet no one can deny their present. On the narrow ledge between atonement and power, Britt and Brad model a new method to defeat an adversary not by pushing them off the board, but by building a floor where every step must pass under light. And once that light is on, it keeps hunting other corners, signaling that the next chapter is not finished and the backdrop has changed. The morning after the nurses' ball settled into the sort of strained quiet that never lasts in Port Charles. The independent committee's working calendar filled with follow-up interviews, document production timetables, and a new tranche of sampling requests that pulled at threads woven through procurement, research scheduling, and communication sign-offs. The data room logs, once a curiosity, became the chronicle by which everyone measured intent and sequence. Britt arrived on the pavilion floor before sunrise, reviewed the overnight IQ metrics, reconciled staffing gaps created by a flu cluster, and signed off on to contingency plans for cardiac OR coverage that Portia had pre-staged in case the traveling surgical fellow's flight was delayed. Every task was procedural, yet each fed a larger narrative. The hospital's new reflex was to anticipate failure points rather than deny them, to pin each moving part to a metric rather than a promise. Brad, on a parallel track, reviewed the anomaly report from the previous night, the unexpected peek into the subfolder for the Medical Technology Center proposal and mapped access events against a rolling 10-day window. What had seemed like a single stray click now resembled a probe, the sort of low-end slow reconnaissance that tests the seams of a system and the patience of its stewards. By midday, a second anonymous packet reached the committee, this time routed through a legal clinic that specialized in public interest disclosures. It contained a narrow slice of an internal presentation from a diagnostics vendor suggesting a communications harmonization plan designed to coordinate press notes with maintenance cycles and grant announcements. The excerpt lacked authorship attribution and context, but it aligned with the pattern Brad and Britt had traced: influence exerted in soft gradients, never so overt as to constitute a policy. Always enough to nudge calendars and copy toward outcomes that favored donors and partners. The committee did not declare misconduct. It extended its document request to the vendor, to the branding agency credited in the footer, and to the hospital's marketing unit for any shared templates. The move was procedural and dull to outsiders, yet inside the building, it felt like the floorboards had given a tired groan. Those long comfortable with wink and nod choreography could feel the choreography itself being audited. Drew moved with the circumspection of a field captain who has lost the map yet refuses the retreat. He shifted his visibility to invitations that looked altruistic on their face: a breakfast convening about workforce retention, or roundtable on health equity and imaging access. A closed briefing with mid-level managers about resilience under scrutiny. His language was measured and communal, his presence careful not to overshadow the executives charged with operations. Still, in white paper drafts and draft emails, Britt could see where a hand heavier than messaging alone had weighted certain arguments toward flexibility and away from enforceable guarantees. She annotated as a physician would annotate an angiogram, here a narrowing that needs a stent of third-party oversight. They're a silent collateral channel that any reform must reroute. She insisted that any philanthropic package be gated by discrete transparency covenants, publication timelines, independent conflict screens, data-sharing commitments, and a named compliance owner whose reporting line ran outside the philanthropy office. The premise was simple and brutal to any would-be narrator. Money carried in the front door would not be allowed to wander the back corridors without a badge. Porsche's guardrails advanced from policy sheets into operational muscle memory. The real-time clinical trial monitor she piloted accumulated enough usage hours to justify expansion. And her team added a low-friction escalation lane that recorded when personnel perceived pressure to deviate from inclusion criteria or visit cadence. The early patterns were instructive. Influence spikes tended to precede marketing milestones. Calendar irregularities clustered near trade show weeks. Friendly suggestions arrived in the gray zone between chain of command and collegial advice. Porsche used those rhythms against the very pressures that created them, publishing a rolling calendar of high-risk windows, pre-authorizing stricter schedule locks, and staging relief staff so the inevitable last-minute pleading could be answered with a calm, documented no. The effect was not to end influence but to make it costly, to require that anyone wishing to bend the rules leave tracks deep enough to be read later. The hospital experienced a systems degradation that never fully qualified as an outage yet stole time from every department. A sequence of brief authentication failures that forced single sign-on revalidations and delayed the morning's batch of radiology pushes. It lasted 19 minutes by the official clock and felt like an hour to those waiting on urgent reads. In the old days, frustration would have fed blame and blame would have fed shortcuts. This time, triage followed Porsche's drill down. A prewritten degradation mode protocol kicked in, an analog whiteboard appeared at CT, a messenger rerouted printed requisitions, and a small perimeter of order reclaimed the corridor. Britt took the pause as a diagnostic in its own right. If a 19-minute encryption burp threatened patient flow, a deliberate misalignment of maintenance and publicity could do real harm cloaked as enthusiasm. She documented each friction, matched it to a compensating rule that had worked, and filed it into the committee's annex on practical safeguards. Reform lived or died in precisely these thresholds where abstraction met the lived hour of care. Brad's audit of the vendor ecosystem uncovered a curvature too elegant to be accidental. Over 3 fiscal years, a primary software supplier had booked strategy consulting to an affiliate domiciled offshore at the close of big upgrade cycles and mirrored those amounts nearly 1-for-1 as price relief in the following contract year. The transactions were legal and disclosed, yet their rhythm functioned like a private lever: cushion pressure 1 year, extract deference the next, disguised both as market efficiency. Rather than spring a trap, Brad arranged a trilateral negotiation with the committee's observer present. He proposed a conversion, reclassify the consulting as campus-wide training grants paid into a restricted fund administered by the hospital, write public, objective criteria for eligibility, publish an annual report of who received training and why, and codify a hard separation between any training spend and messaging approvals. The vendor agreed in exchange for a 3-year renewal and a public letter commending their cooperation. Nothing exploded, something realigned. And because the template was now a template, 2 other suppliers adopted it within weeks, less out of conviction than out of fatigue at revisiting the argument. The committee's second status update landed with the quiet authority of a ledger that has been balanced to the penny. It did not condemn and did not exonerate. It named practices that needed redesign, applauded pilots that had reduced ambiguity, and delineated the next set of reviews, the capture of board member recusals across 5 years. The chain of authorship for patient-facing communications, the conditions under which philanthropic staff could attend scientific planning meetings. It also, subtly but unmistakably, shifted the center of the narrative from personalities to mechanics. In prior cycles, Port Charles exhausted itself casting saints and villains. Now the story lived in timetables, exception codes, and audit trails. That quiet shift took oxygen from rumor and gave it to design. For Drew, this was the least hospitable terrain. His strengths, charisma, urgency, a talent for pulling disparate interests into alignement, were optimized for rooms where the point of the meeting was to leave the room. The new rooms were 60-minute proofs where the best outcome was that nothing interesting happened. He tried one more gambit, a compact to underwrite a community diagnostics access hub at a satellite clinic. Designed to reduce time to scan for uninsured patients and bundled with transportation vouchers and on-site navigators. On merits alone, it was righteous. On governance, it required the same covenants as everything else. Britt and Portia supported the hub and wrapped it in transparency and independent steering council, public monthly metrics, a published grievance channel, and a sunset clause that forced formal renewal contingent on outcomes. Drew could accept these and bank a visible good, or he could push for speed and control and refuel suspicion. He accepted, and for the first time in months, he notched a win he did not have to explain. While the hub moved from concept to blueprint, a separate arc thickened. The legal clinic that forwarded the second anonymous packet reached out again, this time with a would-be whistleblower seeking safe harbor rather than anonymity. The individual was a mid-level account manager at a marketing firm retained by a vendor. They possessed calendar invites, draft copy, and payment schedules that, taken together, established a pattern of prewriting hospital-branded talking points months in advance of supposed independent announcements. The clinic requested two things: a narrow confidentiality order to protect private information unrelated to the disclosures, and a promise that any resultant investigations would prioritize patient safety over theatrics. The committee agreed and arranged secure proffers. When Brad saw the first tranche of artifacts, he recognized language that had brushed his desk dressed as suggestions. When Britt read the calendar entries, she saw how often the proposed news days fell on Tuesdays, the very day the oncology unit struggled with volume and least needed photographers in the hallway. The pattern was no longer an intuition. It could be drawn. The hospital's communications team, confronted with the overlap between vendor drafts and their own publishing cadence, did not circle wagons. They audited themselves. They produced a map of content sources, flagged every instance in which a vendor had sent sample language, and created a visible firewall. Vendor materials now moved through a quarantine desk where legal and clinical leaders screened for conflicts before any internal writer touched the word. They also published a manifesto so short it looked unfinished, 3 bullet points promising that patient care would never be delayed for public relations, that donor recognition would never dictate clinical timing, and that any collaborator attempting to script the hospital's voice would be thanked and declined. The ethos traveled quickly precisely because it did not posture. It gave the department something better to cite than embarrassment when they said no. Then a minor disaster arrived, the sort that either hardens reforms or exposes them as mood pieces. A transformer failure uptown cut power to the vendor-owned imaging suite that handled overflow MRIs, and the cascading reschedule threatened to push fragile cases into the next week. The old instinct would have sought a glossy workaround, an announcement that dazzled and distracted while technicians fought a losing battle against the grid. The new instinct, trained in months of smaller stresses, broke the problem into 4 precise tasks: procurement authorized an emergency rental of a mobile unit, facilities locked a cordon for a safe temporary pad, clinical leaders reprioritized by acuity using published rules, and communications sent a plain language note to affected patients with times, options, and a hotline staffed by people empowered to act. The turnaround was inelegant and human and auditable. In a town that fed on spectacle, the lack of spectacle became the proof. Drew's circle, sensing his frustration and smelling the limits of his toolbox, floated a countermove that would have made sense in another era: seed a meet a narrative about reform fatigue, about the hidden costs of transparency, about the chilling effect of committees on innovation. It was compelling as a pundit's segment and brittle as a plan. The hospital had just weathered a stress event using the very protocols that reform had written. Britt and Portia did not rebut with op-eds. They published a simple after-action that listed what went wrong, what went right, and what would change. Brad appended 6 anonymized data points showing that the average time to reschedule had dropped against the last comparable disruption. The debate did not vanish, it starved. Under the new canopy, individuals changed in ways that did not trend on social media. A junior radiology tech who had once learned to keep quiet filed her first escalation and received a thank you instead of a penalty. A grant manager who had practiced an artful vagueness began to pin her reminders to compliance clauses instead of hints. A charge nurse who had mastered the delicate lie of the rolling delay stopped lying and found that telling the truth took less time. Reform had not made saints, it had given ordinary people a script with fewer traps. The committee, by design, kept its third update then. It announced nothing dramatic. It recorded that recusals were now logged with reasons, that patient-facing communications had a traceable author and a mandatory clinical sign-off. That philanthropic staff attended science meetings only when the agenda called for them, and even then as listeners. It scheduled a final phase of sampling and interviews and, with deliberation, set an end date for its own mandate. Oversight that does not and becomes power by other means. Portia read the date as a challenge. Whatever scaffolding the committee erected had to become bone before the handrail was removed. In the weeks that followed, the Access Hub broke ground, the training grant conversions rolled into their first classes, and the vendor that had been slowest to adapt sought a face-saving pact and received one with conditions. The whistleblower transitioned from anonymous to protected witness. Their testimony became less about blame and more about design flaws that made blame easy. Drew found a rhythm inside the constraints and discovered that a win earned under rules he did not write still counted on his ledger. Brad dialed down the cadence of leaks to near zero, not out of mercy but because the system no longer needed the adrenaline to move. Britt kept accumulating the small victories that only show up when someone graphs 6 months of outcomes, fewer reworks, better adherence, sharper consent conversations, faster recoveries in the cohorts that mattered most. And then, because Port Charles refuses to let any pendulum rest, a draft city budget surfaced with a line item that would fold the Access Hub under a quasi-public authority chaired by an appointee known for smooth deals and soft rules. It was not an ambush so much as the city's muscle memory consolidate what works, then make it efficient. The proposal was not evil. It was dangerous in the way a friendly shortcut is dangerous. Britt marked the paragraph that would allow the authority to synchronize messaging with strategic partners, the old euphemism trying on a new suit. Portia convened a microscopically boring coalition of clinicians and patient advocates to testify about the operational reasons the hub needed a particular kind of independence. Brad drafted a one-page schematic showing how a small, hard firewall inside the authority could preserve the covenants at minimal administrative cost. Drew, whose contacts built the authority in the first place, was asked to persuade his friends to accept those teeth. He did, and he discovered that influence still functioned when it served the grain of the new order rather than cutting against it. What followed did not read as climax. It read as sedimentation. Protocols hardened, workarounds died of disuse, glossy shortcuts lost their audience, and 1,000 modest transactions acquired a habit of traveling through the light. No one declared victory, because victory in a hospital is never declared. Instead, people felt the floor tilt less when news broke, the pulse rate stay closer to normal when schedules slipped, and the meeting after a problem feel like a lesson rather than a trial. The committee packed up its binders and left behind a registry, a calendar, and a culture that made it harder to forget what everyone had just paid to learn. Port Charles, which thrives on extremes, discovered utility in the middle path, quiet competence as the new scandal, predictable processes as the loudest headline, and the improbable pairing of two notorious schemers with the most boring of virtues follow-through. In the end, the story neither anointed saviors nor unmasked a mastermind. It recorded how a system learned to breathe through its nose. Britt's ledger of harms would never be erased. It would, in time, be outweighed by a ledger of care performed within bright lines she helped draw. Brad's reputation as a manipulator would never fully fade. It would, with repetition, be complicated by the unglamorous fact that he learned the weight and use of restraint. Portia's vigilance would make her the least famous hero in a town that prefers fireworks, and exactly the kind of hero a hospital requires. Drew's trajectory would arc not toward exile but toward competence bounded by guardrails he did not choose and ultimately came to appreciate. The vendors would still sell, the donors would still give, the press would still hunt, and the city would still whisper. But the whispers would travel farther to find a willing ear, and the hunt would meet more doors labeled "Please explain" rather than "Please perform." The next crisis would come, because they always do. When it did, the building would not brace for impact so much as reach, almost without thinking, for the tools it had taught itself to hold.